Who was to blame for the Cold War? The question of responsibility for the Cold War has generated one of the most enduring historiographical debates in modern history. The breakdown of the wartime Grand Alliance and the emergence of a bipolar world after 1945 cannot be attributed to a single individual, nation, or ideology. Instead, the Cold War arose from a complex interplay of structural forces, ideological incompatibility, mutual security fears, and economic rivalry, exacerbated by the decisions and personalities of the major leaders. While the United States and the Soviet Union both contributed significantly to the escalation of tensions, the Soviet Union bears greater responsibility for the decisive steps that turned wartime mistrust into open hostility. This essay argues that inherent tensions between East and West made some form of rivalry almost inevitable after the defeat of the Axis powers, but Soviet actions, particularly in Eastern Europe, were the primary catalyst for the Cold War, a view supported by both traditional and post-revisionist interpretations, though challenged by revisionist and some post-Soviet perspectives. The Wartime Alliance, 1941–1945, was always a marriage of convenience rather than shared values, and inherent ideological and geopolitical tensions made conflict highly likely once the common enemy was removed. The Grand Alliance rested on the shared objective of defeating Nazi Germany, but fundamental differences remained. The Soviet Union sought security through a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, while the Western Allies championed self-determination and liberal democracy as enshrined in the Atlantic Charter, 1941. Stalin's behavior at Tehran, 1943, and Yalta, 1945, where he secured Allied acquiescence to Soviet predominance in Poland and much of Eastern Europe, revealed the depth of these divisions. The Percentage Agreement, Churchill, Stalin, October 1944, tacitly acknowledged spheres of influence, but the West never fully accepted Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. The structural incompatibility between Soviet communism and Western capitalism, combined with the power vacuum left by the collapse of Germany and Japan, made a return to rivalry almost inevitable after 1945. The personalities of the leaders played an important but secondary role in shaping the early Cold War. Roosevelt's optimism about cooperating with Stalin and his willingness to make concessions at Yalta reflected a desire to secure Soviet participation in the war against Japan and the United Nations. His death in April 1945 brought Truman to power, whose more confrontational style, symbolized by his bluntness at Potsdam, July 1945, marked a shift in tone. Churchill's warnings about Soviet intentions, Fulton's speech, March 1946, helped shape Western perceptions. Stalin's paranoia, ruthlessness, and determination to secure Soviet security through control of Eastern Europe were decisive in turning potential rivalry into open confrontation. However, personality differences amplified rather than created the underlying structural tensions. Even a more conciliatory Soviet leader would have faced immense pressure to establish a security buffer after the catastrophic losses of 1941–1945, over 20 million Soviet dead. Ideology, security concerns, and economic factors were the fundamental drivers of Cold War tensions, with security fears proving the most immediate cause. The ideological divide between communism and liberal capitalism made mutual suspicion inevitable. Stalin viewed the West as inherently hostile, while Western leaders saw Soviet communism as expansionist. Security considerations dominated Soviet policy. The USSR had been invaded twice in 30 years, 1914–1918 and 1941–1945, and Stalin sought to prevent a repeat by establishing a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. The installation of communist governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, 1945–1948, was driven primarily by security imperatives rather than ideological zeal. Economic factors also played a role. The United States sought open markets and feared Soviet autarky, while the USSR needed reparations and resources from Eastern Europe to rebuild its devastated economy. The Truman Doctrine, March 1947, and Marshall Plan, June 1947, were responses to perceived Soviet expansionism and economic collapse in Western Europe, but they confirmed Soviet suspicions of encirclement. The traditional interpretation, 1940s-1960, placed primary blame on the Soviet Union. Historians such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Herbert Fayes argued that Stalin's aggressive actions in Eastern Europe and his refusal to honor Yalta agreements forced the West into containment. The revisionist school, 1960s-1970s, led by William Appleman Williams and Gabriel Kalko, reversed this view, arguing that American economic imperialism and desire for open markets provoked Soviet insecurity. The Marshall Plan, in this interpretation, was an attempt to divide Europe economically and politically. Post-revisionist historians, John Lewis Gaddis, Melvin Leffler, offered a more balanced view, emphasizing mutual misperceptions and security dilemmas rather than unilateral aggression. Gaddis, in the United States and the Origins of the Cold War, 1972, argued that both sides were driven by legitimate security concerns, but Soviet actions were more provocative. Post-Soviet scholarship, benefiting from Russian archives opened after 1991, has nuanced these interpretations. Vladislav Zubak and Konstantin Pleshakov, Inside the Kremlin's Cold War, 1996, portray Stalin as cautious and defensive rather than ideologically driven, while Norman Naimark and others have highlighted the brutality of Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe, lending weight to traditionalist views. The New Cold War history, e.g., Odd Arne Westad, emphasizes the global dimensions of the conflict and the agency of smaller states, moving beyond a purely superpower-centric narrative. In conclusion, while inherent tensions between East and West made some form of rivalry almost inevitable after 1945, the Soviet Union bears greater responsibility for the decisive steps that turned mistrust into open hostility. Stalin's imposition of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and refusal to allow genuine self-determination violated wartime agreements and forced the West into containment. Ideology, security fears, and economic competition were the fundamental causes, but Soviet actions were the primary catalyst. Traditional interpretations overemphasized Soviet aggression, revisionists exaggerated American economic imperialism, while post-revisionist and post-Soviet scholarship offers a more balanced view that acknowledges mutual misperceptions and legitimate security concerns on both sides. The Cold War was not the fault of one side alone, but Soviet policies in 1945-1948 were the decisive factor in its outbreak.